The laughter hit before the punchline finished. My father's voice carried over the dining room like a slap, dressed as humor. We always said Iris got her looks from Denise and her brains from the dog. My sister nearly choked on her champagne. I smiled, because that's what I'd practiced my whole life, smile so they never see how deep the cut goes. The chandelier above us scattered light over their proud faces, the family I kept trying to earn. They thought I was too slow to notice the pity in their eyes, too soft to fight back. They were wrong. Mom reached for the carving knife and said, "At least you can cook, sweetheart. You'll make some man very happy someday." I nodded, steady. What I wanted to say was that no man would ever own a woman who holds her grandfather's signature on a document none of them knew existed. But instead, I passed the breadbasket and changed the subject to the weather. Let them think I'd accepted my place beneath their jokes. Silence is cleaner than defense. The table filled again with laughter, the kind that keeps score. My father poured wine, my sister recounted her promotion, and they all ignored the fact that the dumb one was the only person in the room with a secret worth $47 million. The check was folded in my wallet between a grocery receipt and a note from my grandmother that simply read, "You'll know when." I knew. I raised my glass, met my father's eyes, and said, "To family." He grinned, toasting the joke he thought he owned. I drank quietly, watching the bubbles climb, thinking of the morning waiting just ahead, when the names on certain papers would change everything. But, to understand why that night mattered, I have to take you back to when the first cracks appeared in our perfect home. Before the jokes, before the wine, and the knowing glances, our family was almost ordinary. We lived in a beige house on a hill where the mail always came at noon, and my mother's roses climbed the porch rail like they believed in her. I was 10 when I still believed in her too. Dad would come home from the hardware store smelling like sawdust and long hours, toss his cap on the counter, and say we were doing okay. Kelsey would race to show him straight A's, and I'd hold up my project cardboard volcano spitting baking soda lava and wait for his nod that never came. He'd pat my shoulder, eyes already past me. Grandpa Harold still called every Sunday. "Keep asking questions, Iris," he'd say. "It's how you learn which answers people are afraid of." He built his life one plank at a time and liked things that lasted: trees, cabins, promises. He treated me like I understood the language of patience, even when I stuttered through it. When Mom scolded me for reading too slowly, he told her that speed only matters if you're driving, not if you're thinking. Summer weekends meant cedar air and the sound of the lake slapping the dock. At the cabin, Grandpa let me hammer nails crooked and never called them mistakes. Grandma Vivian filled afternoons with stories about how they'd fallen in love fixing porch steps, how every board in that house was placed with purpose. At night, I'd listen to rain on the tin roof and believe goodness could be built the same way, piece by piece, if you cared enough. Back home, my parents chased bigger houses and smaller conversations. They measured worth by square footage and test scores. I measured it by who remembered what kindness felt like. When Grandma squeezed my hand and said, "Someday this place will need you more than they do," I thought she meant the cabin's creaking floorboards. I didn't know she meant rescue. Years later, that memory would surface like a buoy proof that love can leave instructions disguised as bedtime stories. It started on a Thursday evening, ordinary light fading through kitchen blinds, spaghetti steaming on the stove. Dad came home waving an envelope and said, "Guess who just aced her scholarship interview?" Kelsey grinned like sunlight. Mom swooped in for hugs. I clapped too. Slow, the afterthought applause that filled our house every time my sister succeeded. Then Dad turned to me. "Iris, you'll take a gap year, right? College might be ambitious." The words sounded almost kind until they settled. Ambitious, his polite synonym for impossible. I looked at the envelope in his hand, crisp with Kelsey's future, and felt mine folding inside itself. "I can apply somewhere smaller," I said. Mom set down her fork. "Sweetheart, some people are gifted differently. Academic life might not be your lane." The pity in her eyes burned worse than anger could. Kelsey frowned like she felt sorry for me. That gentle cruelty reserved for winners who believe they're being gracious. Dinner went on. They talked about dorm colors, travel plans, the family photo for orientation brochures. Nobody noticed my silence. My thoughts were already driving the old road to Cedar Lake. Grandpa's cabin had taught me what to do with things that rot. You scrape, sand, and seal until they can't hurt what's underneath. Later that night, I found Mom's laptop open on the counter. On the screen, Ridgeline Development Proposal, Preliminary Acquisition Targets. I scrolled just far enough to see it. Cedar Lake Cabin, parcel number 47B. The address etched into my memory like grain and wood. They weren't just mocking me. They were selling what little of me existed in their world. I closed the laptop gently, as if abruptness might break the last illusion of family, and inhaled the scent of garlic and betrayal. That was the night the air in our house changed. No shouting, just a quiet shift. The moment love turned contractual. And in that stillness, I decided that silence would be my armor until truth could speak for itself. Over the next year, small cruelties became the language of our household. They never shouted, they simply edited me out. Kelsey's debate trophies lined the hallway where my science fair ribbons once hung. When guests came over, Mom introduced her as our future lawyer, then gestured toward me with a soft laugh. And Iris keeps us grounded. Grounded, another polite term for unable to fly. I tried harder, as if effort could translate into visibility. I volunteered at the library, stacked shelves by color, and learned more from quiet pages than from any dinner conversation. One afternoon, I brought home a community college acceptance letter. Dad skimmed it, tossed it onto the counter. "Sweetheart, save the enrollment fee. You'll just get bored." I wanted to ask if he realized boredom comes from living in a home where belief is rationed. Even the cabin grew distant. They stopped visiting altogether, said the drive was too long and the taxes too high. I kept going alone, repainting window frames, patching holes, pruning the apple tree Grandma had planted. The silence there didn't judge me, it listened. But inside me, doubt multiplied like mold in an unventilated room. Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't bright enough, fast enough, enough. I rehearsed their criticisms until they sounded like facts. Then one winter evening, I overheard them in the living room, voices low. Dad said, "Wade already found a buyer. Once Iris turns 18, we can sign off clean." Mom replied, "She'll never understand the paperwork. It's practically mercy." From my spot in the hallway, I pressed my forehead against the wall and let the paint cool, the heat behind my eyes. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting profit. All those years of being underestimated had become their business model. Something inside me shifted, a slow, heavy click, like a lock turning in an old door. I realized I could spend the rest of my life begging to be seen, or I could start learning what they hoped I'd never figure out: how to hold power, quietly. The next morning, I slipped Grandma's lawyer's card into my bag and drove to the cabin. If pain was my inheritance, understanding would be my revenge. Cedar Lake was half frozen the afternoon I found it. The sun slid low behind the pines, light leaking gold across glassy water. Inside the cabin, dust lay thick as snow. I built a fire, the crackle soft against the winter hush, and started sorting through Grandma's old files stacked in milk crates. Receipts, photos, brittle letters, until one envelope caught my eye. My name, written in her careful blue-inked cursive, Iris. No address, no stamp. Just the name, like she'd always known I'd come here alone. The paper inside trembled faintly in my hands. "If you're reading this," it began, "your grandfather's instincts were correct. The cabin must stay with the person who understands what it means to build, not just buy. You." My breath hitched. Beneath the letter was a second sheet, legal, notarized, dense with language I could barely decipher. Words like trustee, irrevocable, and successor beneficiary. At the bottom, a name I didn't recognize: Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. I drove back to town the next morning, the envelope hidden under my coat. Margaret's office sat above a bakery, the scent of warm bread spilling through the hallway. She was silver-haired, steady-eyed, the kind of woman who made you feel rules could be weapons if you learned to wield them. She listened without interrupting as I explained who I was. Then she smiled. Satisfied curve. "Your grandparents prepared for this, Iris. 6 years ago, we transferred the cabin and its assets into the Tmaine family trust. You're the sole beneficiary when you turn 18. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. They'd known. They'd seen the selfishness growing in their sons and built a wall around me out of signatures and foresight. Your father and uncle have no legal claim, Margaret continued. None. The word rang like a bell in my chest, clear, liberating, terrifying. When I left her office, a light snow was falling. The world felt rewired. Even the air carried meaning. I stood on the sidewalk watching flakes dissolve on my gloves, realizing that love could plan years ahead, long after its hands were gone. For the first time, silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. The weeks before my 18th birthday passed like a held breath. On the surface, everything in our house looked the same: Dad's coffee mug, beside his laptop, Mom's voice drifting through phone calls about overdue bills, Kelsey humming as she tried on prom dresses. But underneath, the current shifted. I stopped reacting. Every sigh, every sideways comment rolled off me like water against stone. They thought I'd finally accepted my place. They had no idea I was memorizing every tick of the clock until midnight struck ownership. Each evening, I drove to the cabin under the excuse of taking a break. I brought tools, patched the roof, scrubbed the stone hearth. But mostly I was clearing the stage. I updated utilities, photographed the property, filed documents Margaret advised me to keep. My thumbprint opened a new bank account under the trust's name. The balance read numbers that felt unreal. I learned to breathe through the fear of power. When Wade called one night, his tone was syrupy. Kiddo, thinking of doing some family paperwork soon? We'll guide you. I kept my voice soft. Sure, Uncle Wade. We'll handle it after my birthday. He laughed, satisfied, believing subtlety equaled weakness. The next morning, I emailed Margaret. They're accelerating. Her reply came minutes later. Stay patient. Sign at midnight. I marked the day discreetly on my calendar, a small dot. No words. I pretended to forget my own birthday party plans as Mom ordered balloons and Dad practiced his speech about family unity. The irony cut cleaner than anger ever could. On the last night before everything shifted, I drove to Cedar Lake again. The wind pressed through the trees like an old hymn. Inside, the trust documents waited on Grandpa's handmade table. I traced the ink of their signatures and whispered a promise. I'll finish what you started. My hands didn't shake. Patience had ripened into timing, and timing was about to become truth. The day of my birthday party arrived bright and deceptively peaceful, April sunlight spilling across the kitchen as my mother adjusted silver ribbons on the cake. 20 guests crowded: the house neighbors, church friends, even Wade, who lingered near the doorway with his ever-present folder. I wore the same calm expression I'd practiced for months: polite smiles, quiet nods, and the serenity of someone about to uncage the truth. Dad tapped a glass to get everyone's attention. Today, our little girl becomes an adult. Cheers rose. Mom wiped a tear. We couldn't be prouder. The applause faded. His voice changed, louder, confident. And as a family, we've made an important decision about the cabin at Cedar Lake. We've decided to sell it and start fresh. The room softened with sympathetic smiles. I set down my cup and stood, heart steady. Funny, I said, because the cabin's already spoken for. Laughter murmured. People thought I was joking. Wade frowned. What are you talking about, Iris? I pulled the folded document from my jacket. The Tmaine Family Irrevocable Trust, I said clearly. Established 6 years ago by Harold and Vivian Tmaine. Signed, notarized, and transferred. Effective beneficiary, me. Dad's color drained. Mom's tray trembled in her hands. That's impossible, he whispered. Wade stepped forward. Where did you get that? From Grandma, I said. She wanted to make sure the one person who actually cared for that house got to keep it. The guests fell silent. The clock ticked in the corner, loud enough to feel. I turned to Dad. You and Wade signed agreements to sell property you never owned. Ridgeline Development. $450,000. That's fraud. The word landed like a dropped stone. Someone at the back gasped. Wade's mask cracked first. You don't know what you're saying. Oh, but I do. And so does the county recorder. Margaret Caldwell filed the trust notice this morning. Dad tried to speak, but the air between us had changed solid now, final. I'd learned their language of business. I was just better at it. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. I just want what was promised to stay protected. Wade stormed out, his phone already in his hand. Mom's eyes filled, not with apology, but realization this was over. The chatter started, whispers, questions, shifting feet. I felt none of it. When the last guest slipped away, Dad sank into a chair. "You destroyed this family," he murmured. "No," I said. "You did when you tried to sell love for cash." I placed Grandpa's handkerchief on the table and walked outside. The evening air smelled of pine and freedom. Behind me the house hummed with the quiet collapse of entitlement. Ahead, Cedar Lake waited, its surface smooth as closure. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of light that makes everything look truer. I sat on the porch step sipping coffee while sirens echoed somewhere far off, a reminder that life outside our drama still moved. Inside, the house was silent. Dad had left before dawn, Wade's car gone from the driveway. Only Mom remained, pacing the kitchen, phone in hand. When she finally faced me, her voice was hoarse. "They're investigating Wade for forged documents," she said. "Your father's furious." I nodded. "He'll have to be angry somewhere else." She flinched, maybe realizing there wasn't a single threat left that worked on me. The county clerk had confirmed the paperwork was airtight. The property's title secure under the trust. Greg and Wade would spend months unraveling the legal mess they created. Margaret said a fraud referral had already been filed. Consequences move slowly, but they move. That week, our neighbors learned the story in fragments, bits of truth traveling through gossip. Some called me brave. Others whispered selfish. I didn't correct anyone. Peace doesn't need spectators. Dad never called. My sister texted once, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." I believed her. A little. Maybe losing comfort teaches empathy better than sermons ever could. When I finally returned to Cedar Lake, spring had arrived. The apple trees shimmered white with blossoms, petals drifting over water like a benediction. I unlocked the cabin with Grandpa's key, same one he'd pressed into my palm years ago. Everything smelled the same: pine, dust, memory. I set new papers on the kitchen table, maintenance estimates, trust statements, college enrollment forms paid from the fund he'd created. The numbers didn't thrill me anymore. They steadied me. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration of names, of promises, of self-respect. Outside, the wind moved through the trees the way my grandfather's laugh once had. Patient, unhurried, sure that time will expose whatever truth people try to bury. People think justice feels like fireworks, loud and dazzling. It doesn't. It feels like the first deep breath after years of bracing for impact. Standing on the porch at Cedar Lake, I finally exhaled. The air smelled of wet earth and thawing pine, familiar and honest. My grandparents hadn't left me wealth. They'd left me clarity, the understanding that protection isn't control and silence isn't weakness. For so long, I tried to earn love by staying small, by proving I wasn't the dumb one. Now I see how clever that myth kept everyone comfortable. It allowed them to believe cruelty was parenting and betrayal was practicality. But patience, that quiet, steady kind, became my real education. Every slight, every dismissal, taught me how to listen without surrendering, how to wait without losing myself. I used to dream of hearing an apology that would make everything make sense. Instead, life handed me responsibility. It's heavier than forgiveness, but kinder in the long run. The cabin isn't revenge, it's remembrance. Each nail, each panel of wood, holds the voices of two people who knew love means planning for someone else's storm. When the sun rose fully, the lake mirrored gold across the ceiling beams. I whispered, I kept the promise. And for the first time, I understood that peace isn't winning against anyone. It's finally standing in a life where you don't need to prove you belong. If you've ever been labeled by the people who should have lifted you up, I hope this story reminded you that quiet resilience is still power. Life has a way of disguising strength as patience and disguising preparation as delay. That doesn't make you behind. It means you're building something that lasts. My grandparents knew I'd face a storm long after they were gone, so they left a shelter made of faith instead of apologies. Maybe someone once did that for you, without words: a mentor, a friend, a stranger who believed when others didn't. Hold on to that. It's proof that goodness leaves instructions even after its voice fades. If this story stirred something anger, relief, maybe courage, I'd love to hear which moment reached you most. Tell me below. Your stories remind others they're not alone in whatever silence they're keeping. And if you believe in calm justice, in love that plans ahead, stay here with me for the next story. Until then, keep your promises, protect your peace, and never forget, family isn't always the people you share blood with. It's the ones who build you shelter when the wind starts to rise.